Hello everyone. This time we are talking about quasi-experiments and what's called small n designs. These have also been called case studies in the past, or any study with only a few subjects that are tracked, usually over time. Quasi-experiments are basically experiments that you can't randomly assign people to conditions in. So something, let's say, a school difference, where one school is doing an intervention and the other one is not. Or maybe in the case of some of the schooling going on now, going to a school versus being schooled within one's home. There's existing differences that you couldn't necessarily randomly assign, but you may want to look at educational differences as a result of, a lot of times which are archivally, housed somewhere. So you just get that data and then test these sort of predictions based on what you find in that data source. So let's get started. So we're going to talk about quasi-experiments, these sort of naturally occurring experiments where we're not randomly assigning something in a manipulative sort of way, although we will maybe intervene in that we could give an intervention to a group of people, but they would be where they naturally are, let's say at work or at school. But we're not randomly assigning necessarily people to those conditions. We get very close sometimes, but not exactly. Small n designs are, like I said before, where it's just a few people studied either because of some maybe unfortunate accident, natural occurrence, or other sort of situation that makes them unique. And in many times, many of them do not exist, right? Such as let's say, traumatic brain injury. Anyways, one of the classic examples of an independent group sort of quasi-experiment is a non-equivalent control group design. So they talk about a couple of these, things like walking by a church versus a different building. I like a lot of examples given in these scenarios. Also cosmetic surgery, getting it or not getting it. These are interesting comparisons that you may have some questions related to, right? So walking by a church, for example, they looked at people who had walked by a church versus walked by some other sort of non-religious building, and gave them a survey, asked them a variety of questions, and you see here the significances are indicated by the asterisk there. And, based on the, let's say, environmental stimulus, it made them think of different things when they were posed these questions. Same thing with the choice to get cosmetic surgery. In this case, it was people that had reached out for information about it from a clinic, I believe, and then either chose to participate or did not. And the researchers even went as far as looking for confounds like income level and tried to control for that and match the people they compared in the group that got surgery versus did not on a variety of outcomes like self-esteem and life satisfaction and general attractiveness. And you see at the surface level, no pun intended, it seems that the people who got the cosmetic surgery seem to be doing better. But we could discuss whether or not that's truly because of the cosmetic surgery or maybe other reasons that we cannot control maybe in these quasi-studies. So quasi-experiments, as I said, are naturally occurring sort of experiments. So they happen to people chose to do something, or maybe a school or other entity, governmental body, chose to make some decision, and some people were exposed to the decision, some were not. So that's why it's kind of an intervention. It's sometimes a purposeful thing, but not necessarily for research purposes, right? Anyways, because of this, the people cannot be randomly assigned, whether it's to medical condition or the state they live in the case of one example we'll give. So usually this is in the field, and by field we mean the real world, right? So real policies in action, real people in schools, getting some sort of education or some other form of education, right? And because of this, there's usually some sort of state records or school records or something that you can look to get the dependent variables or whatever you're looking at, let's say school performance. Many times because of this sort of component that it's housed in schools or governmental bodies, these decisions are usually bigger and more sociological things going on. And so the questions you may have related to, general sort of reactions to overall policies may be different for these sorts of studies than maybe more experimental or cross-sectional surveys or something like that. But of course, quasi-experiments have some methodological limitations we'll discuss, such as the fact that you're not randomly assigning people to groups, which is the main thing, which washes out confounds, we say, because these people naturally occur in their environment, or with the case of single-case designs, they are special in their own way and not necessarily generalizable. That can be a problem, right? So one example I like to give with quasi-experiments is the DARE program, the Dare to Resist Drugs and Violence educational program that happens in some schools, happens in others. In the purest sense, this can occur as just a one-group post-test, we call it, where a group of students are given the DARE programming and then measured on some outcomes, such as inclination towards violence, that sort of thing, right? So some sort of intervention is happening in the school, you measure the students after that. You're not randomly assigning students to a type of DARE program or DARE or no DARE. It's just happening, right? In some cases, the research is part of the program, but rarely is that the case. If that's the case, typically it's more of an experiment, right? In the DARE program, you usually have this in schools, right? So each school sometimes has a unique set of students. DARE is about drugs and violence, so there could be existing differences between these groups. Maybe someone more knowledgeable about certain drugs, let's say, in different areas versus another. In that case, you may want to tap into their existing differences. So we call this a one-group pre-post because you're assessing that dependent variable, that attitudes towards violence or drugs, before and afterwards to look at that change, right? And then you can see an increase, decrease, as well as just where they start and finish. One example of a slightly more sort of naturally occurring experience is people in the Healthy Families America program. In this case, we were looking at caseworker turnover. So the caseworker working with families, either quitting the job and leaving, and the family having to be assigned a new caseworker, sometimes multiple times, or that's never happening. Them having a consistent caseworker, which we hypothesize created a bonding sort of situation, right? In this case, the two groups, right, group 1 and group 2, are the different levels of that IV, and then we measure their continuance in the program as a DV. So the group 1 here is a caseworker turnover, let's say, and group 2 would be no caseworker turnover. And we are hypothesizing this would lead to the families dropping out of the program, so you would never want to manipulate this, right? So this is a post-test only, non-equivalent control group because you have some sort of mock control group or some sort of mock comparison group that you can look for differences in, right? And of course, there's more sophisticated ways of doing this, tracking people over time and stuff that I'll mention in a second, like non-equivalent pre-post. But there's also waitlist designs that deserve being mentioned, like in organizational settings like I study. Training may benefit everyone. So the question there is not if you get training, but maybe when. And so maybe they tell some employees that they're in the first wave, they train them, look at their outcomes, and then the other employees maybe get the second wave. If the training doesn't result in better performance, maybe the second wave never happens. But maybe they at least expect it to, right, to control for those placebo effects of being sectored out or specially selected for training, or potentially just the idea that whatever they're saying actually benefits you in some way. That can raise your self-efficacy, right? And that's what we call those placebo effects. We also look at this over time, right? So quasi-experiments can be looked at in terms of how events correspond in time with other events. So they're the conditions of the quasi-experimental independent variable are really, let's say, different, let's say, national threat levels in this example, different conditions of threat. And then the dependent variable would be economic performance in times of war, terrorism, national pandemics. Those sort of threats correspond to shopping and spending levels. So that's what we call interrupted time series because the points in time are the sort of variables themselves or quasi-experimental conditions that, again, you cannot randomly assign people to points in time, but you can look to see what happened to people at those points in time when specific sorts of conditions were present. In this case, those conditions are the IV and the behaviors are the DV, right? Anyway, so repeated measures quasi-designs, sort of like this, can be described at sort of a more individual level when we look at things like food breaks and parole decisions as one example, and then sort of state-level decisions with governments when you look at this example of the healthcare laws. So over time, with a more myopic lens to individual decision-making, this example looks at judges and the association between food breaks when they had their last meal and the seriousness of their decisions related to parole in this case. So worse outcomes the further away from the food break, right? So corresponding, and you can quantify time since food, right? So if you just ate, obviously, you can actually see in that first example an increase in sort of the beneficial outcome for the parole person. And then it kind of goes down and up and down and up, all the way down to the bottom, where they're getting very unfavorable, probably parole decisions because they're hangry. So that's, sort of individual patterns over time that can be maybe combined in some way, right? Similarly, at the state level, we can look at sort of the enaction of some sort of healthcare law and changes in behaviors in one state versus another, in this case the state where the healthcare law took place, and then sort of an average of neighboring states to see sort of, how many people in this case saw or were unable to see a doctor, related to maybe conditions that hopefully that healthcare law has something to do with, right? Anyways, again, an interrupted sort of time period when that happened. With internal validity, quasi-experiments actually do fairly well in terms of the selection of who you're looking at. Generally speaking, quasi-experiments are looking at specific types of people experiencing certain types of things. In the most direct example, the person walked by the church, and that's why they were selected, right? So it's somewhat purposive. So this is a very strong argument that you have appropriate people for the questions you're asking, right? However, of course, you can't control everything in these quasi-examples because they're happening in the real world. So there's some confounds that can be present. Maybe the people walk by other stuff in the church example. Maybe other things are going on in their life with the cosmetic example, although the researchers did control things like income, right? Of course, with the quasi-studies that are occurring over time, maturation is a threat, changes in the people over time. So their response to certain questions may differ based on their understanding changing over the course of the study. And of course, with quasi-studies history, so if one school has a recent incident with drugs or alcohol, their response to something like a DARE education might be different. So each of those is kind of unique. History looking at the past, maturation looking at the course of the study and the participants changing maybe. And of course designs can happen anywhere, especially based on maybe the types of people you get. Anyway, some other concepts apply, such as regression to the mean, which is the idea that people sort of baseline or stabilize. We tend to maybe score in an extreme, high or low, but over time return to some sort of natural homeostatic level, right? So that may look like change, but it's really sort of our stabilization, if you will. Attrition is important in these because people that drop out of quasi-studies may be special. So some of these studies, for example, used what's called missing case analysis. We're looking to see if people didn't respond to something, or if they dropped out of the study, what they may have responded, or if the pattern of responses indicates something special. Of course, the testing and administration may have its own effects, so learning the test or the test working differently for different people, and then other biases such as rating things in a biased manner from, let's say, research assistants or a self-bias, and the researcher causing changes that they're hoping to detect in something like a demand characteristic is, of course, a problem. With the self-esteem and cosmetic surgery example, what they're specifically looking at there is probably placebo effects, right? The people in this case who chose to get the surgery may expect changes and rate themselves differently without any maybe objective differences, where the people who did not get the surgery maybe have even more negative thoughts about themselves based on this, and then rate themselves based on those negative thoughts, not so much the surgery itself. So, quasi-experiments balance some different things. We say they look at real-world problems, which is great, and capitalize on these real-world opportunities, and because of this have high external validity. There's no argument that some of these studies are obviously relevant to the real world because they're happening in the real world, right? Unfortunately, these things can't be manipulated, so quasi-experiments are benefiting off of the idea that we would not be able to, let's say, create an unsafe neighborhood or create a poor school, but we can look at these differences, as they occur and learn from them. Of course, the construct validity with these studies can be high because we're looking at the exact variable itself in its natural environment in a lot of cases, but the statistical validity may be sometimes difficult to show. If we're looking at slight changes in smaller groups of people, you may not have high significance or p less than 0.05, but it doesn't mean that these differences between these groups isn't meaningful. That being said, with some of these larger archival studies, you may have large data sets that give you statistically significant results that may or may not be practically significant or meaningful in the real world. So those large sample size studies can be just as troublesome. Are they the same as correlational studies? Well, in some ways yes, in some ways no, right? They both use independent group design, so they're both looking at different levels of an independent variable and how that relates to some dependent variable. They both use random assignment. They neither use random assignment correlational studies. They're just gathering people randomly, but not randomly assigning them to conditions, or more looking at their existing standing on variables. And the same thing with quasi-experiments. We're sort of seeing them in their natural environment, capitalizing on what they experience, but not giving them that experience in most cases. And of course, neither use manipulated variables. We're not creating these environments. Although quasi-experiments do use techniques like active selection, right? Using active selection means that we're sort of gathering people purposefully based on what they experience, which almost makes it more construct valid, right? However, correlational studies tend to look at two variables at a time, both generally continuous in nature or scale-based, 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of things. Quasi-experiments are generally more categorical, situation A versus situation B, and then some sort of outcome related to that. So there are definite differences there. In addition to the purpose of sampling, of finding people that have a certain experience, versus just sampling people at large and trying to get as many random people as possible. Small n designs are sort of the opposite of that large correlational sampling, where we're looking at very specific people because of something they experienced, right? So the large n designs, let's say large correlational studies, for example, this is data from lots of people, and the individual people within that data set are of less interest, right? We usually combine them in some way and look at all of the people, overall in terms of their means or correlation coefficients that represent that relationship, right? But with small n designs, it's sort of that each person's reactions or behaviors are individually important, so we can report those individually, right? So with graphs or some other thing, that sort of depiction is important, and less about the statistical significance and overall differences there, more about the pattern of behavior or responses. Some of the examples here have to do with memory and, in this case, seizures resulting in removal of areas of the hippocampus, and then learning differences afterwards, and, certain deficiencies that existed based on the removal, theoretically, of these pieces of the brain. Of course, they couldn't randomly assign this, they couldn't replicate this, but they can look sort of at these sort of post-test changes based on this one sort of case study. Of course, in these sorts of studies on human memory, there's a balance here as well, which highlights some of the issues with small n studies. We have very limited experimental control in some cases. Of course, once sort of this group is known, we can experiment within the subjects like they talk about with memory and manipulating certain types of presentations of things to see how the areas of the brain responded. But for the most case, these are special cases that are hard to replicate, and because of that, may not generalize all the time, right? These individuals may have other sorts of diagnoses that we call comorbid. So in, let's say, the memory example, in that case, the person had brain damage due to the operations due to the seizures. So the epilepsy was the comorbidity here, which may not necessarily generalize to other people. And of course, with every small n study, there's other sort of aspects that may hinder that generalizability. One way we look at these individuals, or let's say animals, in small n studies is with a stable baseline design. So we create sort of a baseline by multiple measurements over time. In this case, words recalled, or the percentage of words recalled, and then some sort of intervention is introduced. And then we look at the, let's say, percentage of words recalled afterwards. So once they've started some sort of rehearsal pattern or entered some sort of educational sort of program, then we look at the multiple data points after that and sort of look at the change before and after. And again, like, this is more individual than group averages in this case. Similarly, in this case, we're looking at multiple children who had fears of dogs, I believe, children with autism who also had dog phobias. And in this case, we're looking at the multiple baselines, comparing over time the treatment conditions and then generalizability, actually, in the last one, to see if different dogs were introduced, how that training sort of continued on to sort of lessen the fear of the dogs. But it's not always about lessening. Of course, in something like education, you can't unlearn, but in some cases, habits or routines return. So when you remove that treatment, the decrease you saw from the baseline to the treatment condition may return back up when the treatment is removed. So you can look to see how the behavior returns, let's say nail biting or rumination or something, and then with treatment, how we can return that behavior back down to a lower level. So we can call this sort of multiple baselines in treatment conditions, or what they call reversal designs sometimes with these small n designs. And of course, there's many more historical examples of small n designs, many psychological studies in the past, such as Piaget, looking at water conservation, Ebbinghaus, looking at memory. Piaget used 3 participants, I believe they say, Ebbinghaus 1 himself. So of course, small n studies that maybe taught us a lot, but maybe highlight the need for replication. So of course, with these small n studies, there's a lot of things you can consider, like the internal validity, the sort of cause and effect. In this case, if you're looking at, let's say, multiple baselines in treatment of a method of getting people to be less scared of dogs, you can see that link between the treatment and the behavior very clearly. So you can argue very, I think, convincingly for the internal validity there, that you see what's going on. In terms of whether what's going on applies to other people, that external validity, that can be somewhat problematic depending on how small of an n study this is, how generalizable these people are to other general people in the public. They maybe also have fears of dogs in that case. Conflict validity, of course, can also be very high if you're looking at the behavior or instance itself. If you have an actual dog, it's not very complicated, right? But sometimes it's not that clear. Such as educational strategies using goal setting. If one educational program does not use goal setting in one school and another school really tries to emphasize goal setting, those differences may not be as distinct as it sounds. School A may use goal setting to some degree, but it's not institutionalized. So there may be some definitional issues there. And then finally, with small n, statistical validity is probably the most problematic because sample size is relevant to statistics, and in this case we're looking for patterns maybe in those graphs more so than p less than 0.05 or something like that. So we can learn a lot from small n studies and quasi-studies, but we maybe have less control over what's going on, and maybe less proof that this can really generalize to other situations. Although with the quasi and small n, they are happening in the real world, right? So that construct validity, that internal validity, can actually give us a lot of evidence that these are very valid phenomenon that we're evidencing in these studies, capturing them. Hope this helps, and feel free to email or post on the discussion board if you have any questions.